Hey, hello chess lovers, and welcome back to Chessway. And today, we have an absolutely wild game played between Lev Polugaevsky and Rashid Nezhmetdinov. This game happened all the way back in June 1958. Alright guys, the game begins with d4 and knight to f6, then c4 and d6. Polugaevsky continues with knight to c3, and e5 follows immediately. Polugaevsky refuses and plays e4, wanting a more open game. Without hesitation, Nezhmetdinov takes the pawn, and Polugaevsky recaptures with the queen. Alright, knight to c6 hits the queen moves back to d2, g6, preparing bishop to g7 and short castle. Polugaevsky copies the idea with b3, and of course bishop to b7 and bishop to b2 follow, and then castle short. White continues with bishop to d3, developing and supporting the pawn on e4. Nezhmetdinov starts attacking with knight to g4. White responds with knight to e2, preparing to castle short.
And now, queen to h4, threatening the pawn on f7 twice. Polugaevsky plays knight to g3, blocking the queen and protecting f7.
Then, knight to e5, attacking the bishop, and white castles short. The game continues with pawn to f5, attacking the pawn and opening the f-file for the rook. White defends with pawn to f3. Then bishop to h6, attacking the queen. The queen moves back to d1. Pawn to f4 hits the knight, and once again the knight has to go back to e2. Nezhmetdinov keeps pushing on the king side with pawn to g5. White plays knight to d5, trying to threaten the pawn on c7. But Nezhmetdinov is the master of attack. He does not care about the pawn on c7 at all, and continues with pawn to g4, threatening pawn to f3. White pushes pawn to g3, attacking the queen. Of course, Nezhmetdinov takes pawn on f3, white recaptures with the pawn, and still attacks the queen. The queen goes to h3, keeping enormous pressure on the king side. Then, pawn to f4, again threatening the knight.
And once again, Nezhmetdinov completely ignored and plays bishop to e6, attacking the knight back. Let's take a quick look. If the pawn takes the knight, then the bishop simply captures the knight back. So wow, this is not even a sacrifice. It is just a trade. Or maybe some of you thought white could take the bishop. Of course not. Bishop to e3 check. The rook has to block, and it still gets captured with checkmate. All right, let's get back to the game.
Here, Polugaevsky does not take and instead moves the bishop back to c2. The knight is still hanging, but black continues with rook to f7, preparing to double rooks on the f-file. White avoids risk and plays king to f2. But of course, Nezhmetdinov plays queen to h2 check, king to e3, then bishop takes the knight, and the pawn recaptures. Knight to b4, rook to h1, threatening the queen, and also a skewer on the bishop behind it. And guys, do you know what Nezhmetdinov plays in this insane position? Rook takes f4. Oh my god, he just sacrificed his queen.
But he's also threatening rook f1, forking check.
Polugaevsky accepts the sacrifice. Let us analyze quickly. If rook to f1 check, rook takes the bishop, rook takes queen, and bishop takes rook, white would be up a rook and a knight in the endgame, so the queen sacrifice would fail. Back to the game. Here, Nezhmetdinov plays rook to f3 check. The king has to go to d4. Nezhmetdinov saves the bishop first by moving it to g7, and now there is a discovered check threat with the knight. White responds with pawn to a4. And guys, this is a blunder. Do you know this is an 8-move forced checkmate? Wow. Of course, Nezhmetdinov finds it. It starts with pawn to c5 check. The king cannot move and must capture en passant. After the pawn recaptures, this is not only a capture, this pawn is also threatening checkmate on c5. Now, bishop to d3, giving room for the king, but of course the knight takes the bishop with a discovered check. If the pawn blocks, bishop takes with check. King to c4, and pawn to d5 is checkmate. So white must play king to c4. Black continues with pawn to d5 check. Again, the king cannot move and must take the pawn. And after recapturing, again, the king can only go to d5. Now the rook joins the party with check. This forces the king to a5. Then the knight goes back to a6 check. And here, Lev Polugaevsky finally resigns. What an absolutely brutal attacking sequence. A queen sacrifice just to drag the king forward. This is insane. If the game continued, the king would have to go to a6, and you all know it ends with knight to a6 checkmate. Such an incredibly beautiful finish. Guys, why do games like this almost never happen in the modern era? Are players simply too strong now? Or are modern grandmasters more focused on system-based play? Let me know in the comments. I'm super curious. Alright guys, that is all for today's video. I hope the video was entertaining and useful. If there were any mistakes, I apologize. See you in tomorrow's video.